Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the channel. Today, I am joined by the lovely K.E. Andrews, author of many books, which we're going to talk about today. I have a few on my shelf here that you can see, but thank you so much for being here with me today, Katie.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Kay.
Absolutely. So, I want to first congratulate you on your recent finalist for Hills of Heather and Bone for Spiffbo, because that's an amazing accomplishment.
It still really doesn't feel real, honestly, because literally it was Sunday. They were like, "Oh, you're semifinalists." I was like, "That's great. I think there's some other books in like the grouping that I think you're going to do really well." And I was also preparing for my surgery the next day, so I was like,
Oh.
"That's fine. We'll deal with it when we deal with it." And then when I had gotten up on Monday, and someone was like, "Congrats on making finalists," I'm like, "What?" What's happening? Am I okay? Like, I haven't eaten in 24 hours. I don't know if this is real or not. And so then everyone was sending me stuff, and then I saw it, and I was like, "Oh, this is real. Okay." So it was just like a lot of things all at once. And so just trying to make it through that week of recovering and then also kind of being like, "Oh, okay, finalist. Wow, I never thought we'd get here." So
That's I can only imagine what a whirlwind of a week that was.
it was. It was a good whirlwind of a week, but it was just like, "Oh, okay."
Have you had a chance to, since then to celebrate in any way?
Yes, I've just treated myself to some stuff, and now I finally got my coins, so it's just like, okay, this is definitely there are some moments where I wake up and I'm like, "Oh, that's right, I am a finalist," because it kind of is just when you don't hear like, with the height of Spiffbo where everyone's like, "I'm waiting for the review to drop, I'm waiting for the review to drop, just seeing
Mm,
if I'm gonna get cut," and now it's just kinda quiet. It's easy to forget, like, it's happening,
yeah.
um, until, like, another review for the finalist book drops. It's like, "Oh, that's right, we're still here." Well, we've got until next year to still be here and do this, so it's definitely great, for my last Spiffbo for a while, just yeah, I never thought it would get this far. I was hoping to at least get a nice review, and so this has been very exciting.
Well, you got much more than, a nice review. So that's great. Mission accomplished. And we have, Joe JCM Byrne in here as well. For those watching, be sure to, check out his books too. If you're looking for superhero space operas with space bears, absolutely a must read. And, Ganesh, thanks for stopping in. So I have a bunch of questions, and you and I were talking about this before. Despite the sheer amount of questions I have more, but we're gonna try. I'm gonna try and restrain myself here. So I wanted to start with you've got a lot of books. You've got 5 books and 2 short stories. Is that right?
Yes, that
Okay.
is right. English was my major, not math, so
Oh. Well, that you've got a head jump on me. My math is terrible. But, I wanted to start with, out of all the books that you've written, if someone's looking to dive into your works, where would you recommend they start?
Hmm. It's a little hard. I would say just depending on like what a reader is kind of looking for. So, like, I have my poetry books. So, if people just really like poetry and nonfiction, I would say head in that direction because they're shorter. They're poetry. Whereas if people like dark fantasy, I'd say The Assassin of Grids and Secrets and possibly Priestess of Moonlight for a little bit of a shorter read. Under the Couch is a short horror one, so people like horror. It's my attempt at horror. I don't do horror. I just thought, "We'll try it, and see what happens." And then if people want, a cozier read that still has just a little bit of an edge, that's where I would say, like, Hills of Heather and Bone.
Mm.
So really it's just depending on, like, what readers want and what they're feeling, so but I'm the kind of person who if the author has a shorter work, I'll always head to the shorter work first before diving into the longer ones.
That's fair. No, I think that's a great way to pitch it. That's where people say try the novellas,
Mhm.
right? If you're trying to test out an author's writing, so that's great. And, I just wanna pull this up here. Tim, welcome. I love the framing on your cover, by the way. All the covers are beautiful. Which one in particular? And which version? Because there's hardcovers that are beautiful too, which we'll actually get into. And Bo, welcome. So, you were an avid reader when you were young, And were there any books at that point in your life which inspired your passion for writing? Because this all starts somewhere.
Mhm. So there were a lot of books growing up. Definitely elementary school is when I really started to get into it.
Okay.
Lord of the Rings was definitely where I got into, like, the heavier fantasy. I did read Harry Potter, Chronicles of Narnia, a lot of classics, like actually, I think some Edgar Allan Poe later in elementary school, surprisingly.
Oh, interesting.
Really, it was Tolkien and C.S. Lewis that really got my interest into it, and then later on, started to get into the bigger books like Game of Thrones towards high school, and then Mark Lawrence's series, Prince of Thorns, and, Tahereh Mafi's, Shatter Me series was really good just in terms of, like, seeing the mix of poetry woven into
Right.
a story was that was kinda like the first time I really experienced purple prose, and I really liked that. I was like, "Okay, so you can still kinda have that without it being kind of Tolkien, which is the long,
Mm.
long expanse about trees and whatever he writes about, but still love it." So really it was just a little bit of everything, but I really gravitated towards fantasy a whole lot.
Okay. Was there something special in fantasy that you had found or connected with?
I just really liked the imagination that could go into the
Mm.
world. Just really liked magic, really liked dragons and whatever else you could throw at fantasy. Terry Brooks somehow made his way in there. I wasn't expecting that at some point. Um, so yeah, it was mostly fantasy is what I read a lot of. And then I was like I also did fan fiction growing up too. So anime and manga was also just grew up on that early in middle school and of
Mm.
elementary school, so that kind of also helped shape me into, like, getting into writing and how can you create stories and just, like, what fun things can you do, and so fantasy felt like there was just so much you could do. There was really no limit to it, so I was like, "This sounds kind of like what I wanna do."
Oh, that's awesome. So now I have to ask which mangas?
Mm, Naruto, Bleach,
Mm,
and One Piece were the OGs for me, but especially
yeah.
Naruto. Death Note, like, there's so many, so many. Full Metal Alchemist, gotta
Yes.
give credit to that. There were some lighter ones like Fruits Baskets,
Mm.
oh my gosh, I'm blanking. There's so many, I can see them. Oh, Kingdom Hearts, when they finally put that
Oh,
in a manga,
nice.
really loved it. So really a lot of everything was kind
Yeah.
of what I what I read, but Naruto, definitely I was there when you had to wait for releases and everything, so,
Oh,
yes, Death Note
the
is a really
waits
good
were
show.
terrible back then.
Mhm, and
Are they
I grew up, like, watching the sub version. I, for some reason, just never
Mm.
connected with the dub, so I was like, I could move a whole lot faster through the series, whereas people were waiting for the dub version, so I that
Yes.
never bothered me.
You had the real tactics there,
Mhm.
strategy.
I was like, "I will
Um,
read my captions."
get your reading in while you're
Get
watching
my
TV.
reading in, yes.
Tim McKay says The Assassins won the paperback for that cover design, and yes, Death Note is fantastic. All the ones that you mentioned are, like, classic animes and mangas, Death Note and Full Metal. So, here's my question then too, on follow-up to that, Full Metal, did you, it was the I guess they didn't split it for the manga. It would have been Brotherhood, right?
It would've been Brotherhood, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah,
So I
'cause I
grew up
keep
with both of the animes, so I watched the
Yes.
original one, and then when they did Brotherhood, I was like, "Oh, this is so much better," even though, like, the first one is like, there's some good parts to it, but definitely it was like Brotherhood makes a whole lot more sense. I don't know what you guys were doing in the other one, but yes, there were some episodes that definitely brought me to tears. I was like, "Ah, this is so impactful," and just the
Yes.
balance of humor and sad moments and everything, and just I really loved it.
Absolutely, I
The art style
completely
was
agree with you
gorgeous.
on that. I I appreciate where they tried to go with the other one,
Mhm.
before the manga was finished, but it definitely made a lot more sense and worked so much better when Brotherhood was done. So, over the years then, have your reading tastes changed? Are they still about the same as what they were when you were younger?
Um I'd say kind of the same. Once I graduated from high school, I dove more into like classics and nonfiction. Normally, I'd only read nonfiction if it was for, like, classes, but I was taking, like, higher level English classes, so I was like, "We're reading the boring stuff that most people are like, 'I hate this.'" Although I never had to read Faulkner until college, so I did get
Okay.
away with that until later, and I was like, he's not my favorite, but it's fine." I appreciate what he was trying to do, so just reading some of, like, the great American classics, a lot of early Brit lit,
Mm,
and just other books from different authors who kind of shaped literature. So I really just dove into that, just seeing like what storytelling methods they were doing. And so because most of what I did was analyze stories and look for symbolism, and you have to write so many papers on, why the author chose to make the curtains blue. What does that mean? So it
sure.
really just kind of honed in what I really loved about character work and story work. So I was
Mhm.
finding books that, were good at that. And I could be like, okay, I can see where the author's going with this rather than maybe genre fiction. So really, I think like Tolkien was like the oldest, or Tolkien and C.S. Lewis were like the oldest fantasy ones,
Okay.
books that I'd read. So I really didn't read a whole lot of the other classics.
Mm.
Until later in college, so I was reading more of the newer ones that were coming out, like Mark Lawrence, and some other ones, but I think now I like the cozy a lot more than I thought I would.
Oh,
Um,
nice.
it wasn't really called that before. I mean,
Mm,
there was the Redwall series, which I guess is cozy, but it wasn't
mm.
called that at the
It
time.
wasn't
I
really
was like,
advertised as that,
"An animal
no.
here, doing fun little things." So, it wasn't like Legends and Lattes where it's like, really nothing is happening besides we're making a coffee shop and, that's enough. And I
We're
like that.
making bonds.
We're making bonds. Um, so I think now I've kind of expanded, especially poetry. Poetry I did not like,
Oh,
in
interesting.
high school and early college, and then I took a poetry class. I was like, "Oh, I actually like this. Now I understand it." And so then I dove more
Mm,
into, poetry works and nonfiction essays and really enjoyed that, because it was all
mhm.
about the author's own character work, and just as long as there was an emotional impact I could connect with, I was like, "I do enjoy this."
Right, okay, and so the learning about poetry, how it's written, why it's written the way it is what really clicked with you.
Mhm.
Okay, that's interesting because I find most people that I talk to about poetry, they love poetry because it evokes something in them, not
Yeah.
necessarily because they learned anything about it. That usually came later because they were moved by poetry as it was. So it's interesting to hear the flip,
Mhm.
right? Where your experience. I definitely appreciate that. And you started writing at a young age. So, from the point that you started writing to being a published author, I imagine you went through various stages as an author. What was that journey like?
Um, so I like kind of the most vivid ones, like memories of writing I really had was in classes where we'd kind of have to do like a group story where you would start with like one section and then you pass it on to someone else and then they would all add to the story and then it'd come back around. So at that time, I think it was like fifth grade, sixth grade. Um, that's where I was like, okay, you can write and have fun and it doesn't necessarily have to make sense. And then when I started getting into like anime and manga, I was like, oh, fan fiction is really fun. So just did that as more of like, hey, this is really fun and cool. And, I think it's the
Mhm.
greatest thing ever, but it's not, looking back on it. And then I started to have my own ideas about a story, which was more like a glorified fan fiction. So I got pretty far into that series, all the way up from 6th grade to about middle of high school.
Oh,
I
wow.
had, like, 7 books drafted, and, like, they were 300 pages each drafted, and I thought, "This is gonna be great, I'll rework it," and then at some point, when I started reading a whole lot more and reading to, like, analyze, not just for fun, I was like, this is not a good story, so we'll stop that."
Mm.
Um, and then I kind of was reading books and thinking, "Oh, I like the idea of this.
Mm.
I didn't know you could do this. So why don't we craft a story around that? More of like maybe I can do it a little bit better, or
Mhm.
this is really what I want to read. So that's kind of where I started with Assassins. I like a female assassin. That sounds fun. Let's see how far we can take that story and be a little bit different than some of the books that had female assassins. So that's really where I started getting more serious into that kind of craft work. So pretty much had that story all the way up until college, end of college, and then when I got to publish it in 2021. So it's
And
definitely changed a lot.
so I have a few follow-up questions just in regards to that because I'm really curious, analyzing it the way you do and the way you've learned to do you outline very thoroughly, or do you allow yourself that ability to still discover while analyzing as you're writing?
So I when I first started Assassins, I didn't do any outline. I was I was super bad about that, and then I actually took a creative writing class in high school, and then that's when I read, Sometimes the Magic Works by Terry Brooks, and he's like,
Mm.
"Even if outlining is, like, the thing you hate the most, you need to have you need to have something." Because I would get through a story and I'd be like, "I don't remember what happened," so I would have to reread the
Mhm.
whole book to figure out if all the pieces were working, so then I would go back, start kind of like a zero draft, which is for me just a basic summary of the whole story. And what are the major people? Where are we going? What major beats are happening in the story? So I really started to do that pretty much end of high school and then onwards. Um, some story outlines aren't very detailed. Like with Priestess of Moonlight, I was like, I want to write a story about a bat woman and something. And that's pretty much all I wrote. It was like a paragraph of Bat Lady trapped in castle. What do we do? Um, and then just kind of wrote around that. And then as I had ideas, and I hadn't gotten there in the story yet, I would jot those ideas down. But usually for like the longer series, I'll do like a couple pages worth of an outline and then do mostly discovery writing along the way. So as long as I have kind of an idea of where we're going, um, it helps me as opposed to let's just start from scratch and we have no idea what we're
Mhm.
doing and it's all up in my head. So
That I love it. I love that it starts with, "I wanna write a book about an assassin. I wanna write a book about a bat lady." Those should be your elevator pitches.
that's pretty much how all my like, I have a folder of outlines, it just says some sort of outline, and then I'll just start whatever the outline is, and it could be a sentence, it could be more than a sentence, but as long as it's like, "Is this an idea?" And it just kinda sits there until it becomes more than an idea.
It keeps poking at you
Mhm.
until you write it. I love it. Um, Mike, we have Mike in the chat. Yes, absolutely.
Hi, Mike.
Absolutely, Mike. Hop on by, send me a message. Um, oh, I'll get you an interview on time. Yeah, one day, Mike. You know what? Let's blame YouTube. Let's blame YouTube for sending the
He's
notification
fashionably
late.
late, and that's okay.
Yeah.
All the coolest
Um,
people show up fashionably late.
that's right. That's right. You're a wizard. That's how that works. So if you could go back to your younger self with everything that you've learned so far, all the books that you've published since then, what's the one piece of writing advice that you would give yourself?
Mm. Um, don't try and put everything you want into a story because it's not always gonna fit and it's not always gonna, like,
Mm,
work with the story. So, like, for me, with my early writing works, I was like, "I want this. That sounds cool. Let's just expand it," like, it and then looking back, it's like, that didn't really make sense for the world or for these
mm,
characters or for, kind of what makes for, clean and cut storytelling. So that would be kind of my advice to my younger self. It's like you can add a lot of things. But if you don't kind of shave off some of the bloat in the story, it's not gonna make sense. It is gonna be just like a fan fiction of I want everything in there. So like you can still have good storytelling even if it's not everything that you want in the world that's a cool idea because there are plenty of cool ideas, but it's like that's probably not gonna make it onto the page, unfortunately, so
interesting. So I like that advice because you can write more, but not all of it has to be in there.
mhm,
So you can, even if you have the idea, you can save it for another day or discard it, whatever you want to do. But um, it's refreshing advice that not everything is going to work. You can
like for
try, but
Assassins, it could have been so much longer. I love world building, and I have, like, just a document of, like, different things that could have ended up in there, and I was like, "We can't have that. Like, I really like this scene,
Mhm.
but it doesn't really do much for this story. And so it's just like we gotta cut it to make this story move a little bit faster and, leave some stuff to the imagination, but,
Mm.
you know, you sacrifice for what is gonna be the best version of your story you can tell, which sometimes is cutting off more than you want to.
You don't want 3 pages about the trees? Come on.
I mean, the trees can be really cool, so in the appendix.
So when you are making those choices, are you focusing more on a balance of character-driven storytelling about the story itself? Are you trying to blend the 2? What's the kind of experience you're trying to get readers to walk away with?
Mm. Me personally, as a writer, I love character-driven stories, and I'm very passionate about character-driven stories because, again, like, without the characters, it's just nothing's really happening. So, when I look at my story, sometimes I'm like, is there enough of the plot in here? Or is it just characters running around doing things? So I ultimately want there to be a plot that the characters following, but also like if a character makes a mistake, how is this going to affect the plot? How is,
Hmm.
their maybe readiness to share something, or, maybe if they've overshared something or they've done something, like how is that going to impact the plot? Like the plot doesn't necessarily get thrown out all the time, but it's like this could have like an impact on the rest of the
Mm.
story and maybe take these characters a little bit longer to get to what their end goal is, or maybe this changes their end goal. So that's kind of like where the discovery writing comes in, where I'll have like the idea of where the story's gonna go. But then it's like, oh, this character's, developing a little bit differently than I thought they would. And that's really interesting. And so maybe I'll head in that direction. Whereas most people who are very plot driven, it's like, no, the plot's gonna stay the same and the characters are gonna have to
Mm.
adapt to the plot, which can work for certain stories. So every story is so different. And so I just really like characters and I think they drive a lot of stories. So
I like that. It's more like a winding path to the plot and flexibility to getting there, rather than a straight beeline. We do have a follow-up question here from Tim, who says, "Do you ever run into the opposite problem, making such a habit of cutting stuff out that you realize later you needed to flesh it out after all?"
Mhm. Yeah, I've had that problem. So before before I, like, got really smart with my writing, I would cut out sections and then it'd be like, "Oh, actually, maybe there was, like, a good piece of dialogue in there that solves some of my problems." So I've started, what they call kind of, like, freezing your ideas, and so I'll put them in a separate document. It could be, like, a paragraph or it could be several pages that I've had to remove, and I'll just, like, put those in a folder, and sometimes I'll go back and take those sections that I've removed and add them in and maybe work them in a little bit better. Usually, if there's areas that need to be fleshed out, is where my beta readers can kind of be like, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Or if I'm kind of looking back through my story for whatever the umpteenth time of reading it, I'll be like, okay, this decision this character made isn't explicitly clear, so why is that? Or maybe this part of the world isn't fully explained, because I've taken that out because I think it adds too much to the word count. So really, if I'm not focused as much on word count and page count and more of like, does the pacing of the story make sense? That's where I can kind of identify like maybe something was cut a little bit too much just for the sake of ending it a little faster. And so that's where I kind of need a different set of eyes to help me
Mhm.
look and see. Maybe you should add more stuff in here, or this is maybe where you need to cut stuff. But I have run into the problem where maybe I should have fleshed out things a little bit more.
It's hard to tell.
Mhm.
It's when you're in your mind, you know everything that you want there, right?
Yes.
And when you actually get it to paper and someone else starts reading it, that's where, um, I imagine it gets really helpful
Mhm.
to discern what actually didn't get translated onto the page. And, so you've talked about, your education and what you read and some of the things you looked at. Was there a writing craft book that helped you, learn, whether it was in your college days or after the fact?
Yeah. Um, So definitely Sometimes the Magic Works by Terry Brooks was really good. On Writing by Stephen King. Oh my gosh. There was the Emotion Thesauruses, which have been really good. I used those
Okay.
more towards the end of college. Don't remember if there was a book on short story writing. I think I just took that as a class of that was my first introduction to short story writing. Um,
Mm.
so just really getting to explore like how how difficult it is to pare down, a much larger story, but still tell like something of quality within 10 to 30 pages, which is so hard. And then it gets even worse when it's flash fiction, which is only 1,000 words. It's like, oh, this is why are people doing this? But then we have haikus, which are, only 3 lines, and you're very limited on what you can tell a story in that. So yeah, really on writing and, sometimes the magic works were the most, influential ones that I read very early on and actually reread. There was oh my gosh, I'm blanking on it. It's like Cat Writes a Novel or Save the Cat. The Save
Okay.
the Cat one was really good. It was kind of the stuff, like, I already knew as a writer of, like, how
Mm.
you plot out a story with certain, like, points of, like, where's the rising action, where's the falling action, where's, maybe this character arc, how does this all fall into place, and just kind of, like, how to structure a story. So those were kind of things, like, with all the reading and writing and, critiquing of other works that I've done, I kinda learned that. So it was just a good refresher on, like, this is if you're really into that kind of plotting and really looking at your story that way, it's a really good book on that.
Awesome, good to know. There's so many books out there. Every time I ask that question, I get so many different answers. So it's fascinating to see which ones everyone's picked up and how it's impact their writing differently, right? Because everyone tells their stories different too.
Mhm.
Um, so I'm gonna put it to the live chat. If you have questions as well, feel free to put those in the chat and we'll get to those. But in the meantime, I want to dive a little bit more into your writing and your books. Now, I've read Hills of Heather and Bone. I've read the short story Priestess of Moonlight. I've read your short story horror as well, and a bit of your poetry too. And there's a couple themes that I wanted to touch on in these questions. So we're gonna dive in. Uh, but actually, before we do that, I want to sidetrack really quick.
That's fine.
Um, sorry, I want to ask the writing question so much, but I
I
also
never
know
get
I
sidetracked ever in my entire life.
yeah. Well, look at that. We have something else in common then. Um, so I noticed that you have a habit of doing this where you have more hobbies than you have time for.
Yes.
Um, Apart from writing, what hobbies do you have?
So the main one, currently is the gardening stuff. So definitely love my plants and gardening, and that started way before the pandemic. So doing home gardening before it was really cool. So I think I had started with like a cactus somewhere in college, and then it's 50 indoor plants later.
Oh,
There's just
nice.
something fun about it, and it's just greenery is great. And then
Mhm.
outdoor gardening's just been fun way of just getting fresh produce and having something to do, and then also just brightening up the outside. So, like doing that. Really just any kind of crafts are great. I do make my own stickers, so I do just some digital design, still learning, how to be better at that. So I run a little Etsy shop with stickers and bookmarks. I really like, cross stitching. I just haven't done it in a bit. Also,
Oh,
that
yeah.
I picked that up during the pandemic, so that was the one thing I did do. Um, and then I just got busy and then forgot to do it because it takes so much time, especially when you're
Yep.
doing really complicated patterns. It's like, where did this one stitch go? What how it's not off, especially if you have to count it into the middle, and it's just like, "Oh, darn, I wanna be able to do this." I've not done embroidery, but I would really like to. It's just very intimidating.
Honestly, I feel like embroidery would be much easier. I've done cross stitching as well, and I've run into the same problems where I start this, those packets
Mhm.
that you buy from the store, and they make it seem so easy. But as soon as they say you have to count however many little
Yes.
tiny and almost invisible squares
Mhm.
to get your middle, and then you realize when you're a quarter of the way through the pattern that you are off by
Mhm.
a lot.
Yes.
Um, motivation goes down.
Yeah.
Let's just say that.
There's a Star Wars one I would love to finish. It's going on 2 years of not finishing it, but it's still there. I still have everything for it. It's
One
just
day.
one day. Um, so yeah, do that, but mostly the gardening stuff's, like, my biggest one. I do love cooking and baking and trying new recipes and stuff, but yeah, really just the digital art and the gardening are the biggest ones. I did try, like, hand knitting at one point, like,
Oh,
finger knitting because
nice.
I have no coordination with, like, the knitting needles, so that was fun to do.
Yeah, knitting is, I knit as well, and, um, it was tricky. It was tricky to learn how to do it, and then on top of that, there's, like, 3 different ways you can knit
Yes.
with just the needles. It's yeah, and then it gets into even, like, I think the 2 main ones are English and continental, and
You know
then
more than I do. I was like, "I know finger knitting."
there's also Norwegian. There's a Norwegian way of doing it as well, so, you know, y
Mhm.
you have to experiment, and experimenting takes so much
It
time.
does. I'm so thankful for YouTube videos because that like, just getting started before they were like, "Do this kind of stitch, then double," but I'm like, "I just have a piece of string and you're, like, already down the string." I tried that with crocheting too. It was like a kit
Mhm,
for, like, beginners, and I was like, "I still don't understand this." And I tried so hard, but really the YouTube videos were the ones that helped me the most. I was like, "Okay," once I got, like, the how to form the lines and everything,
mhm.
like, I got that. The most complicated thing I did was a cat bed. I knitted a cat bed, and
Oh,
that
nice.
yeah, it was a lot of fun. The first one, the walls were, like, too big, so they kind of fell in, which my cat doesn't mind. He will sleep on it anyway. So I was like, I have, chunky yarn's better. I was like, the bigger the yarn, the the better I feel, as opposed to just tiny little things that we gotta
Yeah.
go undo. But I would love to be better at it.
It's just practice. That's all it is. Trying new things, trying easy patterns, and then delving into the more complicated ones. So I guess that might cover the next question. I don't know. We'll find out. If there's a hobby that you haven't started but would like to, what would it
Mm.
be?
Definitely embroidery and actual knitting with needles. That always seems like it'd be so much fun.
Yeah, I there's something to be said for, and we're talking about cozy earlier, there's something to be said for how cozy it is to just sit down and focus your entire attention on something like that.
Mhm.
You also worked for, or you work with an organization called The Love Story.
Mhm.
What is this organization? What do they do?
So, the love story is just kind of currently we're on an online platform, focused on, journaling, therapeutic journaling. So really just kind of taking creative writing and using that a little bit more focus to just express yourself. So it's we have these online workshops where we do journaling sessions. So it's a little bit more focused as opposed to like, Dear Diary, today sucked. It's more of you can set like kind of like what you're feeling to either fiction or you can, be a little bit more honest and real. And
Mm,
we kind of challenge people to look at the different points of views and see how that maybe reveals maybe where some of the issues are. Like first person feels more like just kind of generic. Like you can just word vomit what you're feeling. It's more personal in that
mm,
regards. Whereas second person, it's kind of more almost like an investigation because you're using you, which could either be you yourself or you as someone else who's reading it. So it
mhm,
has kind of that duality to it that's really fun to explore of in your own writing. And then third person kind of gives you a little bit more distance from what you're writing. So when you're writing like an event in third person, it can take away some of that like sting and maybe you can look at it a little bit more clearly than you would first person or second person. So we were just trying to like really fine tune how we want to do our journaling sessions. The hope is to eventually kind of go into schools and use this as a tool for either high school age, college age of, you know, journaling seems so silly, but it's like it's so powerful that you can kind of get what's in your head down on paper a little bit more, and it doesn't have to be, like, necessarily fully true. It's just, like, trying to get out what you're feeling and express that in your own kind of way. And so when we do, like, our journaling circles, it's not a critique on, like, the writing, it's more of, like, what we call resonant editing, where you look at the different sections and say, "I really feel that. That really resonates with me," and you don't really have to explain why, and so to the person writing it, you can say, like, "Oh, someone else is feeling that way," and, it's really comforting to know that even though, your full story isn't expressed in that way. So it's one and just kind of an encouraging booster for people, and then also to just give them a space to express themselves. Um, and that's kind of where I got my start with my poetry, because we also kind of want to do a section where we take the journal entries and then get those published for some people, because it's just like, it's first off, it's hard to publish anything, but then to publish something that's, centered around mental health, trauma, pain, your story, your very personal story, but to have something out there that, other people might also enjoy and learn from and really connect with is also a good morale booster. So we're trying to I was part of the pilot program of test driving that and trying out the different, like, points of view of how do you journal that way? How can you maybe take the same journal entry and write it like 3 different ways to kind of reveal a little bit more truth about what you're telling yourself and telling others. So, it's been a fun project just to see it kinda grow, and just, with COVID and everything, just the amount of people who wanted just that connectedness and just didn't really know how to express themselves, but now have this new outlet of, you don't have to just write about your day. You can be a little bit more focused and kind of identify maybe repeating patterns or what really actually hurts you, and then start to deal with that. So yeah, that's it in a nutshell.
That's fantastic. It sounds very, freeing, in all honesty, that it just sounds freeing, and so if anyone here watching was interested in this, is there somewhere they can find it or take part in that?
Yeah. So it's just simply thelovestory.org. um, we're still kind of like trying to fine tune everything and audit our website just to make sure it all
Mm.
makes sense, because we've had it for so long, and now that we're trying to like really send it out to people who are not in our immediate like building group, just trying to make sure if that makes sense. How does this work for people who've never journaled before, or for high school students as opposed to like older adults?
Mm.
So we've got like a lot of artist interviews, so people who have taken their own personal stories and how they've used that in their own art, either like cooking, singing, books, whatever. And then we've also got like journal entries that have been submitted by people who've gone through like the journaling programs. Um, so we've got like just a variety of resources for that. So,
Oh, that's fantastic. All right. Well, what I'll do is after we're done chatting here, I'll actually put that link in the description below for anyone who wants to check that out. Because that honestly, it sounds fantastic to be able to just sit down and write uh, write things out.
mhm,
Oftentimes, I know for myself and a few other people I've talked to, where things just get muddled the more you think about them. So I imagine writing them down is, it gives some clarity
mhm.
to situations or circumstances you're going through. And, we have Kylie here as well as Tori. Thank you so much for stopping in. So you also work as a freelance editor. I'm really curious how this has impacted your writing, because I've met some authors who also do editing, but they can't edit their own work. So I'm really curious how that's been like for you.
It is hard, and I will say it you can't really self-edit your work fully, just because, again, I feel like you're too close to it unless you've had it
Mm.
sitting on a shelf for, like, a year and you've not looked at it, so it is completely new. So that's always kind of a difficult thing for me, because 'cause it'll be, like, after the book's published, I'll be like, "Oh, now I see all the issues," as opposed to
Mm.
before, getting it done, because 'cause you've read it, like, 65 different times and your brain just kinda fills in everything of, like, "I know that sentence is supposed to be this way," and then you're missing a word, or something is spelled incorrectly. Um, So it's always fun. You become really good at proofreading after the fact. So with editing, I really enjoyed getting to work on the developmental side, which is where you're kind of really focused on building the story. How does the plot work? How do the characters work?
Mm,
Does the world building make sense? And really just digging into like those parts. So I think
okay.
that's really helped me in shaping my own world. And then I also worked at a writing center in college, so that helped me like with other people's works of like pretty much everything you write has the same kind of thing of like, what are you trying to convey? Are you doing it are you doing it clearly? Does A to Z make sense and everything in between? So it's whether it's nonfiction or fiction, it's like it kind of follows that same format of, how is your beginning, how's your middle, and how's your end? So that was really just exciting to me to get to move around all those puzzle pieces and then to
Mhm.
do that in my own books, which can also be, difficult when you've been
Yeah.
staring at and daydreaming about it for so long, and then when someone else is like, "That doesn't make sense," it's like, does it?" And then later you're like, "No, it doesn't make sense." Um, so I really, really enjoy that. Proofreading's definitely not my favorite as much,
Mm,
because that's more focused on, are all the commas in the right place, and English
mhm.
when you start getting into, like, English and British editing styles and that
Yeah.
kind of English, it's just so confusing depending on, like, who's writing the book. Are they want like, if they're American and then wanting to write it at British style, it's like, "That's so confusing." Stop. Please.
Yeah. I
And I mean, unfortunately, no editor is gonna know every single
mm,
rule, which is why there's books for that, and you should refer to all your books. And then some things are just left up to how the author wants to style it. There's sometimes things are really wrong, and other times it's like, "That's okay. You can do that. It's your own style." Um, but especially with M dashes, it's always I will remove those in my own writing, and then when I see it in other people's, it's like, "That's probably a little too much. I don't think you're using that right."
right.
But I think
I
it's given me I think going through, like, editing courses and then editing other people's works has helped me with my own understanding of, like, how punctuation's really gonna affect your
mm,
writing. Like, a comma here is gonna have a completely different meaning, even if,
mm,
you it doesn't mean what you think it means. It's like it's usually gonna indicate a pause or, something else, or, just how a sentence is supposed to kind of flow, and those kinds of things. So, really giving me a better understanding of like, what is this? How the ellipses maybe don't need to be used as much because it's really either to indicate trailing off or something else. It's not. Don't use it for
right.
dramatic effect, please.
I love it, and I appreciate the comment regarding where you put the comma because it's true. People, characters, I imagine even are going to say things in different articulations. They're
Mhm.
going to have different nuances to how they talk, dialects, even things like that. So, I certainly appreciate that perspective on it and that information because the way when you described it, the way I thought of it was musicality. When you're a
Mhm.
musician and you're looking at sheet music, we have breath marks that basically look
Mhm.
like commas, and they'll be up in a top portion of the bar between sections, and basically all that is to just pause. But
Mhm.
there are like 5 other ways you can do that, and it's all
Yes.
to musical preference, so, really interesting to see the similarities between the 2.
Especially, like, when you get into the weird ones, like semicolon, an actual colon, N dash, and then M dash, and then just again, like, ellipses and all those all those weird ones. It's like, "This looks right." It's like it can there's also, like, kind of visually how it looks on the page, and then also when you're reading it, it's like, this one piece of, like, punctuation is meant to do this. It's not
Mm,
some the thing like I see a lot of is like the semicolon. It's meant to connect two independent clauses, not an independent and a
right.
dependent. If you wanna do that, you just put a comma or put a period. So, sometimes if I don't know the rules or if someone else doesn't know the rules, I'm like, "Just go with what's gonna be simpler, even if you wanna try and be fancy." It's just for me, sometimes when I'm reading, I'll have to shut that off in my brain because 'cause I'm like,
Right.
"That might not be where you need it to be." But again, I'm also still learning like new things and, what's correct, what's are we
Mm,
going with like this author's own personal style? Or do they have a set of, like, publishing house rules, those kinds of things,
Right.
which getting into it's all all vastly weird. But I came from just the academic side where it's like AP, APA, Chicago style, all those fun, fascinating things, and then MLA, which is where I love to be because they don't require you to do much as an English major. It's just
Oh,
MLA. Maybe some APA, but
okay.
nothing else. So, but, like, the rules sometimes change for certain, like, specific things, but most of the time, it's
Mm.
like, it's not really gonna change, but, yeah, I like the mention of musicality because for me, I'm like, yeah, if I'm reading it and, like, suddenly there's, you know, a stop when there shouldn't be a stop, I'm like, I'm not sure what's happening. And I
Go
don't
back
think
and
it's
read that line.
flow quite like you might want it to, but, I might be looking at it a little bit more critically than someone else who's like, "This is fun. I'm just reading."
Well, I mean, when you're an editor, like, when you've got that experience, it's hard to unsee those things,
Mhm,
right? So, it's absolutely gonna impact your reading differently. Now, I wanna dive into something here with your books,
mm,
because you format them beautifully, not just on the outside. For anyone who doesn't know, they are beautiful on the inside with artwork throughout. Let's see here. I wanna go to so in this copy anyway, of Hills and Heather and Bone, each chapter starts off with beautiful artwork, and they're all thematic, right? The flower is
mhm,
representative of the themes of each chapter.
yes.
So, how did you learn this skill?
Um, that's a very good question. It was a lot of trial and error for sure. So with my poetry books, those were like my first ones. So with the interior and everything, when I'd first downloaded Vellum, I was like, oh, there's a lot of cool things I could do with this. Cause I'd heard people, they're like, well, I use Atticus or I'll actually just format it myself in Word. And doing that in Word sounded a little too scary to me. Cause I'm like, I'm not going to play around with those margins and just trying to do all that. I was like, I hate putting images into Word or Google Doc. It just doesn't work because you move it and then all of a sudden all your text is gone somewhere else. So I'm like, I'm gonna actually get a software and invest in that. So
Mm,
Vellum gives you just a lot of great options to do for ebook and physical copies. So pretty much all of it, it'll set like its own margins for you. And as far if you're not doing like something crazy, the margins are pretty much going to stay the same. So I'm like, well, that's taken care of.
okay.
And then you can play around with fonts. You can play around with the headings. It was only like kind of recently in the last couple of years where they allowed you to do kind of the artwork on the back of the page. Like you could do like
Mm,
very stark or faded. So I was like, oh, that's really pretty. I really always appreciated like pretty
mm,
books. And I was like, well, no one else is going to do it for me without like cost an arm and a leg. So I'm like, I'm going to figure this out. And so Vellum makes it very easy
mm,
to do all that stuff. So I was very happy with that. Um, just like sometimes its downside is like you don't really see how it is until you get a physical copy. So with like
mm.
Assassins, trying to make sure that there weren't just like random white pages after like my ornamental page breaks was just
Right.
more of like I have to have a physical copy to kind of see that and see like how can we move the text around? Can we make it smaller so
Mm,
everything fits on the pages? Is it some books like their chapters on like the right side or the left side? So it's really just kind of a puzzle of, if I format something this way, how's it going to affect the rest of the book? But I always knew going into it, I was like,
mm.
I want a pretty book. It's nothing that can look pretty, although I also want the story to be very nice. So Assassins
Mm,
really, was, like, my first big one besides my poetry books,
mm.
where that one I was like, "Well, I knew I want photos in it." And so with my first one, like, they were all black and white because I didn't know I could do color cheaply. So I was like, "Oh, darn. Oh, well, so we need to change that."
One day.
Going forward, I was like, "Okay, I can do this. I can, do these kinds of things." And so, definitely when I got to Hills, I was like, "Okay, this is kind of what I wanna do a little bit
Mm,
differently." And it might cost a little bit more to do, but I was
yeah,
very early on, I was like, "I want, like, that kind of imagery to help with it." So it's more
right.
more than just, like, a chapter heading or, anything like that. Yes,
Yeah.
that was like, "We're gonna do full color for the hardcover because why
That
not?"
that was the, you realized you could do some color in there.
Mhm.
I have to say I thoroughly appreciate the attention to detail because your hardcovers feel, and even the paperbacks, they feel like special editions without the heavy price tag, right? 'Cause, it's, there's lots of Kickstarters and lots of beautiful books that are coming out, but I know for myself in Canadian, it usually goes over $100 for those copies very
Mhm.
easily, and then that's not including shipping.
Yes.
So to have an affordable, beautiful book is so, so great.
That's always been my struggle. So, like, I love seeing the Kickstarters, but I've always been, like, afraid to ask, like, "How'd you get that done? Where'd you get that done?"
Right.
Because it's like I know Broken Binding does their own press and everything, and so it's
Mhm.
like someday I would love a wonderful embossed cover with gold leaf and whatever, um, to do that, but it's just like, what can I do with, without having to ask people for money? Because again, at this
Right.
point in my writing career, I was like, "Well, I'm not, like, you know, Sanderson level known where I'm like, I could just post
Mm.
something and then $100,000 rolls in from a Kickstarter or something like that.
Break
So,
the
well,
internet.
we're gonna maybe garner some more interest. We like, let's see what we can do to make it attractive and,
Mm.
really showcase the story, and maybe start to play around with some of the things I would love to do in the future, with what I know how to do now. So, yes, thankful to Sarah for just the amazing, artwork in the back, and then, Marcella, who had done the front of Hills, and then the character work, which again, I wouldn't have found her unless she reached out to me and she's like, "I did a little doodle for your book. I read it
Oh.
and I loved it." I was like, "Oh, that's great." And then I was like, "Ooh, I can ask her to do work, for me." And then I'd always wanted Sarah to do some work too, just to kind of have that balance. And so I decided, well, let's just put both of them in there. And I would love to do
Yeah.
one for Assassins someday when I have time. Maybe once the second book is done and people stop asking me for the second book. Um, so I have, like, a little bit of a breather, but
Right. More time to focus on it.
more time to focus. 'Cause it takes time. It definitely takes time to kind of format, because I also, like, formatted the covers myself, just learning how to do that and, like, Canva and everything, was definitely a learning experience.
Oh my
Assassins
gosh.
was getting that thing published was so hard. Those
I
margins are so annoying.
Oh, no.
And then, like, it's
I
off by, like, 0.05, and they're like, it especially when you get into the hardcovers, it's like, you need this to
Mm.
extend past this, and so, depending on what size the book is, and it's just, it's always a learning curve for
I I can
doing.
only imagine with the time involved too, because like you said, you make one change, everything else changes. You have to
Mhm.
constantly flip through and be very aware of what's happening to the rest of the
Yes.
book. So if there's an author who wanted to do something similar, what's the top tip you would recommend to them to get started with learning how to format?
Mm. Um, I would definitely say, like, invest in some sort of software if you, because Atticus is good, but as far as I understood, like, it didn't have, like, as much stuff as Vellum did. I think that one's either a little bit cheaper or kind of the same price as Vellum. If you're wanting to do like a lot of artwork and stuff,
Mm.
I highly recommend Vellum, even though it's for Mac only. That's the only downside.
Oh,
It'd be
yeah.
nice if they expanded. And did that. But if you don't want to do it yourself, just investing in someone who maybe kind of knows what they're doing is always good because it definitely, if you get someone else to do it and they do it correctly, it is less of a headache as opposed
Yeah.
to you are doing it yourself. But I enjoy doing it myself at the end of it because it's like, yeah, now I know, how the page margins work, how all this kind of works and going into a book, which again, like the beauty of self-publishing and indie publishing is if you do a lot of the things yourself, I think you get a better appreciation and understanding of like what goes into like major publishing houses where it takes all these
Yeah.
different departments to do. And if you can kind of do it yourself and get something pretty decent, it's like, wow, okay, this is fun. After all the tears and crying and, like, I don't want to be an author anymore. This is too hard.
Oh Well, and if something needs fixing, you can fix it in your own
Yes.
schedule. You're
Mhm.
not relying on someone
Yes.
else's
Mhm.
availability. That's
So, yeah.
another big thing.
Also Canva Pro is definitely
Okay.
worth investing in because you can just adjust, like, the sizes of like, there is a book, like, cover option, and then once you either get, like, your template from Amazon or Ingram Sparks or wherever you're trying to, like, get your book published through, like, they'll give you, like, the dimensions and everything, and if you can
Mm.
figure out if you can figure out all the dimensions and what they're saying, you can, make a halfway decent cover, if not a really great
Mhm.
cover, once you understand how margins work and everything, so but Canva's great.
Margins, the hurdle of cover art.
Mhm.
Okay, so I wanna do a quick check-in with the chat. If you have any questions, pop them in the chat, and we'll, make sure to get to those. But in the meantime, we're gonna go back to your writing because I still have more questions, believe it or not, people. I So, I mentioned earlier where having read some of your books, there's a common theme that I've noticed in them. Um, and it's twofold. So we're going to start with the first one. The first is your ability to capture atmospheric storytelling. Because when, like for Hills of Heather and Bone, and even The Priestess of Moonlight, both are very atmospheric in their own ways. They capture the world and the tone of the story beautifully. So I'm really curious as to your approach in accomplishing that. How do you make it feel so atmospheric?
Mm. I don't there's not really a simple answer for that one,
There
so
never is.
before I ever started writing, I was, like, really big into art. I loved art. I'm a very visual person, so just being able to, like, look at art and sometimes you kinda would have to describe, like, what is it you're looking at? So just
Mm,
knowing kind of, like, what the words are for, colors or what lighting you're looking at or, just any of those kinds of words. So kind of going through different art classes and, taking just watching movies and all those things just kinda gave me more of the vocabulary of, like, how can I start to describe things? Is this gloomy? I always kind of think of my books as, like, movies. Love to see the scenes kinda play out in my head of, like, what kind of vibe am I going for?
mm,
Very much aesthetic and vibes, so trying to figure out, okay, if that makes sense for this, different word connotations can like help set the scene whereas like one word might mean something in a different setting using this word in one way is going to kind of shift everything so just kind of being aware of that and I really think once once I started taking like more poetry classes where
mm,
the whole goal of poetry is to kind of capture that emotion through like the words, whether or not they're simple or they're long or, rhythm and pacing. So just trying to, play around with that of like, does that sound cool? Or does that, kind of paint that picture? So really, I think the artistic side and the poetry side, just trying to meld those into like, how does this work in
mhm.
writing where there's no pictures? Um, so it took a lot of, like, trial and error and just, like, can my audience visualize that? Because I can definitely visualize it. Um, so, I don't know. It's a mystery how any of the words, make sense on the page, but somehow they do.
They do, absolutely they do, and you definitely capture the tones and that vibe that you were saying because it comes through. That's for me, one of the biggest things as a reader is when an author is able to capture that atmosphere of the story and it sets the tone, right? And for me, I find a the atmosphere, that vibe that I felt while reading it lasts with me longer than events
Mhm,
will in the book, because I'll always come back to that feeling, whereas remembering exactly what happened
mhm,
in the book. So I certainly appreciate it. It's a skill that seems more difficult to me as a reader um, than trying to explain everything is just one of those things so difficult. But you do it really well. So the
thank you.
second part of this is the emotional experiences, the second fold of it, because you do a phenomenal job with that too, at capturing the emotional experience. You're not afraid to show the good with the ugly. And with Hills of Heather and Bone and your poetry, you often cover a variety of life experiences that particularly in fantasy, they're rarely seen so well represented from what I've read. So, did you pull these from your own life experiences? Did you consult with others? How do you make the characters and the emotions they feel so human?
Hmm. So I think it just goes back to kind of my basis as a person is I'm very emotional. So I always connect with like more emotional things anyway, because it drives so much, even if it's,
Mm,
just calm scenes or, anything like that. Like every action or something is driven by something. And,
mm,
I really wanted to kind of put that out. Not like, "Oh, these are emotional books, or touchy-feely books," but just like, these characters have emotions, like, the things around
mm,
us affect who we are, and, so I wanted that to carry over into the characters' lives of, like, they're all bringing in, like, different life experiences, things they're
mm,
coping with, things they're not coping with, things they're experiencing, and so to just kind of almost like psychoanalyze that and just how are they doing their things, and how's that gonna, impact the story, and then the one thing I really wanted to see more of in fantasy was kind of dealing with mental health struggles, even though there's no therapist in these worlds. Um, like a character that's experienced trauma of like, how are they going to deal with this? How are they not going to deal with it? And how, in not dealing with it, is this going to affect the rest of their journey or their
mm,
relationship to others or, good and bad choices, especially for morally gray characters of, you can have a tragic background, but how is that going to impact you either making good decisions, bad decisions, or just okay decisions? um, and so just really kind of not all the experiences they go through are things that I've personally gone through, but just to
mm,
see like, okay, so how is a character who's gone through this, is that event gonna be their whole identity, or is this going to be,
mm,
a driving force for them? How can they maybe go through some things, but not let that be their whole defining character? Because 'Cause I've seen that so much,
mm,
especially with like women in fantasy, like either, some sort of sexual assault or loss or something like that is all that they are. Like,
mm,
I think there's like a fine line between that because again, like they're not necessarily things that should be like pushed under the rug. It's like they're okay now, it's great. But other things of like, okay, if they're still carrying around this baggage, is this, how is this gonna affect them as a character? Or who are they besides their trauma and pain? So wanting to kind of do those explorations, and that was just it always seemed very fascinating to me. So both with,
mm,
The Assassin of Grins and Secrets and Hills of Heather and Bone, where it's like 2 very different characters in dealing with their, life experiences and, like, things that have happened to them, and how they go about either trying to overcome those things or work through those things or, whatever they're trying to do in the story.
mm,
So really the mental health aspect was important to me of, it's not gonna be one clear cut thing of, a character who's gone through this is going to exactly experience this, just like,
mm,
someone else in real life would do that. So that was kind of knowing like the true stories that people go through. And then also like this character is very different from these people. How might they react to this given the situation they're in, the tools they have,
mm,
just other things and just getting to kind of play around with that in a way that felt realistic. Um, so again, like there's no for certain things it's like there isn't like this is the right way to do it. This is, that's this is how they should act. Of just like, is this something that people can relate to, even if they've not gone through those
mm,
experiences? So with the things in both books, I, had people who had either gone through similar situations
mm,
or, did a lot of reading of stories that focused around those issues just to kind of get, what are maybe some normal responses people might have, what are, journeys they've gone through. So ask people like, does this make sense? Does this seem like too too over the top? Or, is this, is it something that should be in literature and writing? So it's just, experimentation, and then
mm,
just seeing like, is this gonna connect with readers in a way that maybe I don't know. I don't know the best word to describe it, but just it was yeah, it was a lot of because they're hard topics to talk about, and so
mhm,
wanting to give it the care it deserves without kind of going over the top and making it like the whole story, because I didn't feel like with certain things, like this was a story about a character who's dealing with this thing,
Mm,
and this is just all about that. It's like they're also doing something else in the story, but they're also bringing this baggage into
right.
like everyday life,
Mhm.
as most life is. Like the places of work, you take your day with you, even though like, please leave all your baggage at the door. It's like I can't. It's fucking
Yeah.
um so that was, some challenges with some of the characters because, like, well, I definitely wouldn't really act this way, but then trying to put
Mm.
yourself in your character's shoes about how they might act was, both fun and challenging in that way. So, did have a lot of consultations with people on certain things.
Well, and I think that's great because you're only one person. You've only had so many life experiences, and you might want to cover a topic that you haven't gone through. So, consulting with other people, reaching out to them, chatting with them is, I think, a really important part, especially if you're going to try and capture that.
Mhm,
It gives your story more of an authentic experience as a result. Yeah. So I I love that you did that because you captured them so well, and
thank you.
it's very impressive. You also dived into something we don't see very often in fantasy with Hills of Heather and Bone, which is a married couple, at least one that doesn't fall into the typical romance tropes
Mm,
or the typical fantasy tropes where it's, one for all and all for one. Um,
mhm.
so seeing a real relationship in that setting was unique. And at what point did you say, I want to write a story about a married couple that is outside of the box?
Um, I think it was very early on in the story because again, I was not expecting to write Hills of Heather and Bone at all. I
Mm,
was expecting last year when I wrote it or was writing to work on my book too for Assassins. And then I'd seen something like an image somewhere or someone's idea of like, oh, a necromancer couple on the run. I was like, oh, that's fun. Necromancy's fun. I'm like, well, you know, a married couple in writing just sounds really neat to write. Because
mm,
again, yeah, like you don't usually see that. It's either, like people who are wanting to get married or like people who are just
mhm,
entering a relationship. And that's usually one of my big pet peeves in writing, like why I don't normally like romance books because it's
mm,
always either like that's the whole plot. I'm like, that can't be the whole plot. There are other things happening in this world. So it's just like, let's, have these two characters and just add another fun, exciting, kind of cool layer to this one character I wanted to write about. And so, and then another thing I hadn't seen was like maybe an older couple because sometimes it's like,
mm,
oh, newlyweds, or something else like that. So I was like, well, let's do it just a little bit further along in their life, and they've been together, they know each other fairly well, and they're settling into a
mm.
life. And that was just, it sounded very interesting to me because again, it wasn't something I really saw. And so, where characters are less awkward in a relationship because I'm like, I don't know how to write a romance from the beginning stages, and I
Mm.
don't wanna start really because that's not the main focus. So, definitely had a lot of, like, help with that because 'cause I'm like, well, I love Percy as a character, he was really fun to write, but then I was like, "Is he too perfect? We gotta make him a little more complicated and messy." So just, like, how might these situations affect, like, their
Mm.
marriage and just it's not necessarily about them staying together. It's more of just like, how are we gonna, still love each other and deal with these things while things are happening. Um, and so just, like in normal life, just took a lot of like experiences from
Mm.
people who aren't married and like, how is this? And, how might this happen? So it was just seemed really fun because I'm like, well, this poor girl MC on her own is probably not going to do really well. So just having another kind of person in your circle during like all these hard times where you're both kind
Mm.
of experiencing your own pain and happiness and joy and a little bit differently, but also still together was really fascinating to me. So
Mm.
it was just something that seemed fun to write, and so I was
Yeah.
like, "We'll go with that."
Oh, I love it. I love that you took that turn with it because it's not something you see very often. People, authors and stories tend to go for the hard hitting, right? The fast, get readers involved, like you said, the early starts of the relationship, usually where it's infatuation is what I've
Mhm.
seen.
Or
And
dead spouse. Dead spouse is also
dead spouse.
the
That's
one, the dead spouse. It's usually the wife, someone's
it
dead.
it's like Disney with the moms are just not in the picture, right?
There's so much I've written papers and read discussions about that, like the dead mom trope and, like, what does that mean? Like, so many of Shakespeare's work,
Yeah.
like, the mom's always dead. It's like, what does this
Why?
why?
Be nice to the moms. So,
Mhm.
yeah, I love that you did that and you took a chance on it, because I think it's I would imagine it's hard to make that choice. You're gonna dive in and you're gonna explore it. Like you said, you had to reach out to people and chat with them too, and, um, that, that's a lot of work involved
It
when you're
is.
just writing, yeah.
But
Um,
I'm, like, so thankful for, like, the people who beta read, like Tori and,
mm,
some other people who were able to give me just different insights into, what pieces can I take away to add to this fictional couple who is, not really based on a whole lot of real life people, but, and still make it kind of realistic, even
mm.
if it's not like, "That's exactly how my marriage is," or anything like that, of, like, what's realistic enough but still unique enough to this made up couple. Um so, yes, shout out to all my married friends who read this. Thank you so much.
Ah, I love it. Okay, so I have the hard-hitting question here for you. Where did the inspiration for More Henna come from?
Yeah,
Because More Henna to me is the true star of the story.
yes. Also very early on in my growing up experiences, I had never been around chickens a whole lot, and the first time I, like, was really up close with them was a little bit traumatic for me because 'cause I'd seen them kind of, like, I think it was, like, eating a dead one, and I was like, "Oh, I didn't know chickens could do that." I mean, it's like I knew they ate bugs and other things, so I was like, "Oh, cannibalism's a thing. That's right. Chickens are a little bit terrifying." And then also my mom had stories of her, like, childhood of being, like, attacked by a rooster, and, I mean, I knew of cockfights and everything. I was like, "Yeah, I don't wanna be near that." They taste great, but I don't think I'd want to own one or be
Mm,
near one, so I'm like, "That seems a little bit scary." And then there were these, Instagram reels that I'd seen several years ago. It's, like, called Useless Farm, and so it's this emu named Karen who would always attack the one woman, and she finally, like, talked about why the emu would attack her, which is a whole lot more
yeah.
terrifying than chicken. But it's just 'cause, like,
I know
it really
exactly
likes your
that.
husband, and it didn't like her, and I'm like, "Okay, so what do you do with it with a like, a giant bird that's gonna come at you?" And so I was like, "We're gonna pare that down to a chicken that still doesn't like you, because I mean, chickens are not always nice."
Yeah.
And so I thought it would be funny, and I was like, "That'd be so great if the chicken likes one person and doesn't like another person." And it seemed like the perfect animal for, like, just a cottagecore setting. Um, um, so she was really fun, and just the play on words with the names
Mm.
was great too. I just that was very early on. I was like, "I want fun chicken names."
So where did the name come from?
So it's based off the name Morwenna, which I got
Okay.
first from watching Poldark, and I was like, "That's a really pretty name. I'd love to use that somewhere in writing." And then I couldn't figure out a place to put it, and then I was like, "Oh, more henna." We just changed it. Again, just doing the puns and stuff, and just it kinda that's where it became, just fun for that. And I don't remember if someone had suggested it to me, if I came up with that on my own of, like, make fun names for the chickens, but it ended up in there, so
That's awesome. More henna, yes, Ganesh says it perfectly. 1,000%
it's
more
very
henna walks with the gods far above us mortals. And the fact that you got that idea partially from the emu, because I know exactly which emu you're talking about. That emu is hilarious.
it's hilarious, and I'm just like, "Yeah."
Yeah.
Whether it's a big bird or a small bird, birds are just you don't mess with them. Like,
They've got favorites.
they've got secrets, they've got tempers, they're some of them are really smart and they will outlive you. So I'm like, I won't mess with the chicken, just I like eggs and I like chicken to eat, but I'm just like, no, I couldn't do it."
Everything else, they can stay away.
Yeah, like, I healthy respect for you.
Final call to everyone in the chat. If you want to post any questions for Katie here about her writing, anything like that, post it in the chat, and we'll cover it before we close out. But in the meantime, I've just got a couple more questions for you. Out of all the worlds you've written, of everything you've done, which one would you like to visit and why?
I probably would survive longer in, Hills of Heather and Bone, so just 'cause I loved building the world for assassins, but again,
Mm.
it's desert and there's a lot of sun, and I'm not built for that. Very much like poor Uriah, that was my self-insert, was just, "We're gonna burn easily, and it's hot," and it's just we're not doing well in that. So it's pretty, but I just physically could not live there, whereas Hills of Heather and Bone, I'm like, "It gets cold at least, and there's less sun." There's still sunlight, but it's not like
Scorching.
90 plus humidity, scorching desert. So that one I had a lot of fun with because I always wanted to write a Scottish inspired world.
Mm,
So that one just was a lot of fun for me, just because I had more personal experience with that one, just being in Scotland a couple times,
mm,
and being like, I can visually see this, I know what it feels
mm.
like. Plus, I get to add the Highland cows, which are my favorite animals. So just it was a lot of fun. Plus, it was a lot smaller to create, as opposed to Assassins, where it's like we got a whole continent we're writing about, and just the garden vibes in Hills is
Mm.
always very near and dear to my heart.
Yeah, I can imagine those 50 plants. I'm sure all of them got a cameo somewhere in
Somewhere,
the
yes.
so what's next for you? What are you working on next? What can readers look forward to?
So I'm working on book 2 of The Assassin's Creed Secrets, and I've been trying to revise it for the past year and a half. Again, that was we started revising it last year, and then Hills of
Mm.
Heather and Bone happened, and then last December, I thought I was gonna be real productive and revise both at the same time, and turns out you can't do that
Oh.
with 2 big fantasy books. So I opted to do Hills first
Mm.
because I wanted to enter it in Spiffbo. So, almost done with this round of revisions for book 2 of Assassins. Pending release next year, we'll see, I don't know. Um, it's becoming a lot longer than I thought it was gonna be. So currently we're pushing about 700 pages, and then we'll have to pare that down. And then I'm working on hopefully a fantasy western novella. I was trying to get it done for NaNoWriMo, but did not finish it. But I got a lot further in it than I have been. So hopefully, maybe also publish that next year. I don't know. We'll see.
You're working on it though, that's the
I'm
important
working on
part.
it. That's the main thing I tell people. Like they'll be out when they're out, and
Mm.
I don't know, but you'll know when I know.
That's great. I mean, thank you so much for chatting with me, for going on a dive into all kinds of topics. And for anyone who's watching, be sure to check out the links in the description. Go check out K.E. Andrews' books. Whatever you enjoy, if it's poetry, fantasy, I'm sure you'll find something because she writes beautifully. They are incredible stories. Definitely go check them out. And thank you all for watching as well. And thanks again, Katie, for joining me.
Yeah, thank you again so much for having me on.
Absolutely, anytime. And as always, everyone, take care of yourselves.